Criminals have to face the judge and jury no matter where they are in the world, but most of them are hoping to be either found not guilty or given a short and easy sentence, no matter how horrendous the crimes they committed are.
Verdict Form B. We, the jury, find the defendant Daniel Villegas not guilty of...
However, when justice is served, a lot of the convicts are unable to handle the punishment. When reality hits them and they realize they will be spending many years behind bars, quite a few convicts react in a bizarre manner that leaves the courtroom and internet astonished. But when you do the crime, you've got to serve the time. This is how 15 convicts reacted after hearing their sentence. Number 1. Jacob Matthew Morgan. Jacob Matthew Morgan was just 17 years old when he did the unthinkable. Back in March 2015, the young autistic teenager took the life of his toddler half-brother. Jacob cried before the court as he pleaded guilty to starting a fire that took the life of his 14-month-old brother Joshua Hill. Jacob and his family belonged to Rock Hill, South Carolina, and they actually stood by their eldest son. His mother, Julie Hill Dover, did not consider her son a criminal and protested his innocence in court. She said that they had always believed in his innocence because they know their son. He loved his brother, and it was a tragedy that poor Joshua could not be with them for long. Jacob's mother and her husband, Mike Hill, had left Jacob to look after his baby brother. He told the investigators that Jacob was asleep when the fire started. But at previous court hearings, Deputy Solicitor Willie Thompson revealed to the court that Jacob waited outside the home as it burned down. He didn't call for help or try to save his brother, all of which points towards malice. Jacob had developmental issues and struggled to read or write, so when he admitted to starting the fire under duress after a 5-hour-long interrogation, his parents were convinced that the boy was coerced. But investigators said that he gave them a number of different accounts about how the fire started. At his preliminary hearing, Jacob broke down into tears and collapsed on the floor while prosecutors talked about the fire that took Joshua's life. Later in February 2016, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Jacob again cried in court while pleading guilty. Addressing the court, he said, "I love my brother. I still do to this very day. He's my best friend. He was the only brother I ever had, and I just wish I could have gotten to him in time." Number 2. Maurice Fuller. Maurice Fuller is the teenager who was convicted for taking the life of his ex-girlfriend and attempting to take the life of their mother in their Kenosha home of 2019. Fuller was found guilty of a jury for the death of 15-year-old Kaylee Jugga and injuring Kaylee's mother, Stephanie Jugga. The prosecution revealed that Fuller blamed Kaylee and her mother for getting him expelled from school and removed from the football team. He was just 15 years old at the time. The mother and daughter were upstairs in their home during the afternoon, a little while after returning from school. They were planning on going to a family camping trip when Fuller snuck through an open window in the garage as he had intimate knowledge of Kaylee's home, her daily schedule. The prosecutors also argued that he had cased the home before the incident. Stephanie identified Fuller as the person who took the life of her daughter before her eyes and then assaulted her. Judge Mary K. Wagner sentenced Fuller in May of 2019. Prosecution asked for the maximum penalty in the case as it had a root in domestic violence and because Fuller hadn't taken any accountability for what he did. He was sentenced to life in prison. Maurice Fuller, who had been completely remorseless throughout the proceedings, finally showed the first signs of emotion during the 6-day trial. He cried at a few occasions, with his head resting on the table in front of him. Number 3. Ryan Stone. Ryan Stone was 30 years old back in October 2015 when he was convicted for carjacking 3 vehicles, including one with a 4-year-old boy inside it. He was found guilty in April of 2015 of 11 felonies, including first-degree assault for injuring a police officer who tried stopping him. According to the Douglas County District Court Judge Paul King, Stone told him that he regretted the crime spree he went on back in March of 2014 that spanned 5 counties. He prompted a 75-mile-long car chase that was broadcasted live by the Denver news station's helicopter. The pursuit started in Longmont, a town 30 miles north of Denver. Here, Stone, who failed to appear in court for possession charges, stole a sport utility vehicle from a convenience store parking. A child was in the SUV when Stone sped away. He was heading south on Interstate 25 at a speed of 100 miles per hour, according to authorities. In Brighton, he crashed the SUV in a minivan and abandoned it with the child still inside, who was fortunately not injured. He was then witnessed yanking a woman driver out of her car, stealing it, and speeding away. He again crashed the car near Denver International Airport and fled again. After crashing another car and running, he was finally arrested. He was sentenced to 160 years in prison and would only be eligible for parole after serving 75 years. During sentencing, prosecution showed the court recordings they had gathered of the calls Stone made to his friends and family that did not help his case. He laughed about the chase and gloated about the worldwide attention he received because of it.
My lawyer told me I made the news in the UK and Australia. If you type in Grand Theft Auto on YouTube, my comes up first.
When he spoke during sentencing, he looked quite shaken and teary-eyed. He tried to explain some of the recordings. He said, "I pray the victims in this chase can find it in their heart to forgive me because right now there isn't a day that goes by I don't feel horrible for that March morning. I'm so sorry for any and all anguish I have caused anyone." Number 4. Shondell Jackson. Shondell Jackson was convicted for taking the life of a University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee film student named Nathan Potter by a jury back in February 2010. Shondell was just 19 years old and was party to a crime of first degree and attempted robbery in which Nathan, who was just 21 years old, lost his life. Potter was walking home to his apartment when he was assaulted and wasn't carrying any money. During the trial, Shondell showed no remorse for the victim's death or his crime. He even made a point of smiling at the victim's family, due to which he was escorted out of the courtroom. When his life sentence with no chance of parole was announced, Shondell got out of control. He spat a string of obscenities at the Milwaukee County Circuit Judge Rebecca Daly, while 3 deputies and detectives James Hutchinson dragged him to the floor of the courtroom. He was pepper sprayed and taken under guard. While the authorities tried to subdue Shondell, his family members standing in the back began taunting the victim's family. Assistant District Attorney Mark Williams had already shown the judge videos of Shondell reacting when the jury had delivered his guilty verdict. Back then, he had turned to Potter's family and spewed obscenities at them too while smirking devilishly. Besides the life sentence, Daly also sentenced him to 5 years in prison for an unrelated fatal assault with a weapon that had occurred on the same day Potter died. Luckily, no one got hurt during his outbursts, except for Hutchinson, who was hit in the eyes by pepper spray. Number 5. T.J. Lane. T.J. Lane is a remorseless teenage criminal who was convicted for taking the lives of 3 students at an Ohio high school in 2012. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole by Judge David L. Fury, who noted Lance's visible lack of regret and motive as part of his reasoning for the strict sentence. Lane had pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including taking the lives of Daniel Parmerter and Demetrius Hewlin, who were 16 years old, and Russell King Jr., who was just 17. He also seriously injured 3 other students. Lane shocked everyone, but he appeared in the Chardon courtroom while wearing a white t-shirt underneath his button-down that he exposed during the proceedings. On the t-shirt, he had written an incredibly offensive word. He also smirked and showed the courtroom his middle finger. The 3 students who TJ injured and the relatives of the 3 victims who lost their lives were given an opportunity to address the judge before sentencing. Relatives of the students who died had already indicated that they wanted Lane to get the maximum sentence. The mother of Daniel Parmerter said to the judge, "I want him to suffer the rest of his life, the way I suffer the rest of my life without Danny." Lane could not have received the death penalty as he was a minor at the time of the crimes, but he was given the next most severe sentence, ensuring he spent the rest of his life in prison. Number 6. Manson Bryant. Manson Bryant had appeared quite frequently in the Lake County Court of Common Pleas. He was also not a stranger to Judge Eugene Lucci's courtroom. The prosecutors revealed to news outlets that Bryant had a lengthy criminal history back since 1999, when he was just a minor. He'd already been sent to prison at least 3 times for 4 different cases, and at least 8 of Bryant's criminal cases had been assigned to Judge Lucci in the past decade, as per court documents. The most recent case was a home invasion in Plainville Township that occurred back in July 2018. Bryant was on parole when he was arrested for the said invasion. The jury found him guilty of several charges, including aggravated burglary, aggravated robbery, kidnapping, and abduction in 2019. The hardened criminal was presented before Judge Lucci to hear his punishment. In hopes of getting sympathy and a lesser sentence, Bryant told the judge, "I've made a lifetime of bad decisions. I respect you and I respect your decision." However, this sentiment was short-lived as the judge sentenced Bryant to 22 years in prison. On hearing this, the defendant launched into a tirade laced with profanity that was recorded by the courtroom cameras. He was outraged at the 22-year sentence and accused the judge of being a racist. Bryant, who was actually facing 30 years, had actually been granted a lenient sentence by Lucci, who had considered his remorse. But because of the outburst, he changed his mind and added 6 more years to the prison sentence, and instead of 22, Bryant will now serve 28 years in prison. This is also not the first time Bryant had misbehaved with Judge Lucci. In fact, he had done the same in 2014 when he was sentenced to a year in prison after pleading guilty to receiving stolen property. Number 7. Dexter Johnson. Dexter Johnson was just 19 years old when the jurors convicted him of a capital crime in just 2 hours. The teenager was facing the death penalty after being convicted in the carjacking, robbery, assault, and death of Maria Aprise in the summer of 2005. He was one of the 5 people who carjacked Aprise and her boyfriend in June 2005. The couple was just sitting in the blue Toyota Matrix outside the boyfriend's home around midnight and talking. Johnson, along with his friends, threatened the couple with a weapon, threw them in the back seat, and drove them around Houston demanding money, credit cards, and ATM access numbers, according to the prosecutor. Lisa also told the court that Johnson had fun taking the life of Aprise and her boyfriend. She said he wasn't just getting money, he was doing horrible things. The prosecutors revealed Johnson assaulted Aprise in the car after parking it near a patch of thick woods. Aprise's boyfriend was forced to listen to it on his knees as the 4 criminals taunted him. When the 4 men read the verdict, Johnson could not believe that he had been convicted, and he covered his face with his hands. He was definitely angry and stormed out of the courtroom through the side door as soon as they adjourned to the jury room. The condemned criminal was eventually given a death sentence, and this was just one of the many crimes that Johnson committed during a month-long spree of violence that year. Number 8. Kayla Norton. Kayla Norton, with her partner Jose Torres, did something vile and incredibly racist. The couple was convicted and sentenced to prison when they made racist threats against a group of black people at a child's birthday party. According to a CNN report, Torres was sentenced to 20 years with 13 in prison after he was convicted on 3 counts of aggravated assault, 1 count of making a terrorizing threat, and 1 count of violating Georgia's Street Gang Terrorism and Prevention Act. On the other hand, Kayla was sentenced to 15 years with 6 in prison. The sentence stems from an incident that occurred in July 2015. Torres and Norton, along with a group of people, joined a group of Confederate flag wavers driving through Douglas County in Atlanta. Most of these flag wavers were part of a group called Respect the Flag. The group passed by the victim's residence that was hosting birthday party for a child. Then they parked their trucks near the house, and Torres, along with some others, retrieved a weapon and threatened to hurt the partygoers while using derogatory racial slurs against them. Both Torres and Norton looked distraught by the verdict. Norton also apologized to the court for her role in the incident, saying, "I want you all to know that is not me. That is not me. That is not him. I would never walk up to you and say those words to you. I am so sorry that happened to you. I am so sorry."
Not me. That is not me. That's not him. I would never walk up to you and say those words to you, and I'm so sorry that happened to you.
Number 9. Eric Pendleton. Eric is a young-town father who received the maximum sentence in a case where an infant was the victim. Prosecutors revealed that he shook his infant so violently that he was permanently disabled. The 37-year-old man was sentenced to 11 years in prison on 2 separate charges of endangering children. In March 2017, when Pendleton shook his son, who was just 3 months old, it caused him to go deaf and blind. The boy was unresponsive at the hospital. Prosecutors requested Judge Anthony D'Onofrio to impose the maximum sentence possible, keeping the injuries suffered by the boy in mind. The prosecutor said, "Baby Eric Jr. was the biological son, is the biological son of the defendant. He was in position to protect him, care for him, nurture him, and instead he caused great harm to him. He's going to suffer visual disabilities, hearing disabilities, and will have to remain in a wheelchair permanently because of what Eric did." Pendleton maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings and claimed that he had been falsely accused and wrongfully convicted. He said that he couldn't be remorseful of something he knew he didn't do. But when Judge D'Onofrio announced the 11-year-long sentence, Penland burst out into a fit of rage and shouted that he didn't do anything. However, McLaughlin and the foster mother, Lawson, said that they were glad that Penland received the maximum penalty. Number 10. Anthony Rodriguez. Anthony Rodriguez was convicted for assaulting a deaf woman at the Martin Luther King Park in Bakersfield. He had just turned 18 and was out on parole when he robbed the unsuspecting 25-year-old woman after dragging her around 105 feet into a bathroom. He had already been arrested a few times previously for violent behavior, but this time he crossed a line. Anthony remained silent and unresponsive throughout the court proceedings, but his calm demeanor couldn't last long as the judge handed him a sentence of 25 years to life. On hearing this, Anthony began crying. His face was red and he looked flustered. With tears in his eyes, he directly started talking to the judge, hurling obscenities at him and claiming that the ruling was not fair. The deputies had to force him to sit back down. Despite knowing the severity of his crime, he was unhappy with the ruling. In fact, his family also thought the judge had been too hard on Anthony. His mother later told the news that he didn't deserve life in prison. Number 11. Kayla Mendoza. Mendoza is an American woman who was convicted for taking the life of two women while driving under the influence in Fort Lauderdale, Florida back in November 2013. She was just 20 years old and did not have a driving license. Mendoza invited public wrath when it was discovered that she had tweeted "too drunk to care" just hours before the fatal accident. She was driving her Hyundai Sonata when she drove into the Sawgrass Expressway the wrong way at a speed of 80 miles per hour and collided into a 2012 Toyota Camry. Inside the Camry were Caitlin Furnett and Marissa Cataronio, both aged 21. Cataronio passed away instantly after the crash, while Ferrante spent a few days in the hospital before she succumbed to her injuries. Mendoza also called herself a pothead princess on her social media account and posted pictures indicating that she was dependent on several illegal substances and alcohol. In May 2015, 2 months after pleading guilty, Mendoza was sentenced to 24 years in prison. She was also given 6 years of probation after her sentence and was permanently banned from driving a motor vehicle. Mendoza apologized to the families of her victims in court, saying that she would trade spaces with them if she could. Before the sentence was announced, she also read a letter to the family saying, "I think about them every day and I regret my choices every day. I don't remember deciding to drive, so I can't even tell you what was going through my mind when I made that decision. I have no excuses for anything I've done, I just ask for forgiveness." Number 12. Adrian Dunn. Adrian Dunn is an ex-con who was convicted by the jury in July 2012 for taking the life of a 24-year-old man named Rakeem Tariq Charles. Charles was assaulted in his apartment complex parking lot during what prosecutors described as an illegal substance transaction. During their closing arguments, prosecutors told the jury that because of his elaborate criminal record, Dunn deserved a life sentence. Jason Gross, the prosecutor, held the hand of Charles's mother and urged the jury for a life sentence. He said, "So there will never be somebody like her son who has to suffer and his family has to suffer because of the defendant. And that's why we're asking for a life sentence." Dunn's attorney, however, proposed a lighter sentence, ranging from 35 to 40 years in prison, would be more appropriate. Defense attorney David Garcia argued that a lighter sentence will give Adrian a chance to go into prison and try to make something of himself, so that when he gets out, he can get better and be an asset to the community. But Dunn's behavior ended his chance of leniency as he got into a brief skirmish with the deputies in court the day he was convicted. Dunn had an outburst laced with profanities directed towards the court, and he briefly wrestled with several Bexar County Sheriff's deputies while they tried escorting him out of the courtroom after the jury sentenced him to life. Number 13. Van Brett Watkins. Van Brett Watkins was 40 years old when he was convicted for taking the life of Cherika Adams, who was also the girlfriend of Ray Carruth. Cherika was pregnant at the time. Watkins pleaded guilty to taking the life of Cherika, harming her unborn child, and assuming an occupied vehicle. He admitted in court that he was the one who pulled the trigger. Cherika couldn't make it, but her baby boy survived. Watkins testified at Ray Carruth's trial, saying that the former wide receiver for NFL's Carolina Panthers paid him to take Cherika's life as Carruth didn't want to pay for her child support. According to prosecutor David Graham, Cherika's family wanted Watkins to receive more time behind bars than the minimum. The judge also agreed, as crime was particularly atrocious and the aggravating factors outweighed the mitigating ones. Although prosecutors did acknowledge that their case was built around Watkins' cooperation, so he was given a plea bargain. He was handed down a 40-year and 5-month prison sentence by Superior Court Judge Shirley Fulton. Before his sentence was read, Watkins apologized to Cherica's family and admitted how much he regretted doing what he did. He said, "Mrs. Adams, I am very sorry for what I did, and I'll be paying for it in heaven." Sandra Adams, Cherica's mother, nodded at him and mouthed, "I forgive you," as she believed he did seem truly remorseful. Number 14. Blanca Regalado. Blanca Regalado is a Miami resident who was accused of trying to take her husband's life. She was arrested in March 2013 after police found her husband suffering from several stab injuries. According to police reports, Blanca told the officers that she assaulted her husband because he was abusive. When Blanca was denied bail by Circuit Judge Jorge Rodriguez Chomat, she became hysterical and started screaming at the judge. During this outburst, Regalado was in a wheelchair, and she told Rodriguez Chomat that he broke her leg and begged him not to keep her in jail. She had to be retained in her wheelchair, as she was wearing a cast up to her knee, but it was unclear how she'd gotten injured. Blanca also refused to leave the courtroom while the bailiffs tried to control her. Blanca's attorney also argued that the next hearing that her offense was bondable. She said, "To my knowledge, there is a standard bond of $10,000 for that charge," but the judge refused to grant bail despite that. Regalado was shaking, but this time she was calm and apologized for her behavior. Number 15. Brandon Spencer. Brandon was just 21 years old when he was sentenced to 40 years to life in prison for wounding 4 innocent people outside a Halloween party. The incident occurred on the USC campus back in 2012. Brandon was convicted on several counts in February after he fired a weapon outside the party that was sponsored by the Black Student Assembly in October 2012. During the trip, prosecutors argued that the incident was a result of a feud between Spencer and a rival gang member. Brandon pleaded for leniency in court and requested for a second chance at life, but as his sentence was announced, he was outraged and reacted aggressively. Earlier, when he had heard his conviction, Spencer had flipped over a chair and begged the deputies to end his life. Spencer pounded his head against the desk twice as his sentence was read. Deputies gathered around as he sobbed. Deputy District Attorney Antonella Nistorescu claimed that Spencer was seeking vengeance when he assaulted the reputed gang member Gino Hall outside the party, but his defense attorney pleaded for a lenient sentence, citing that several people showed up in support of Brandon.